Officer Sarah Martinez had been working the night shift at the Riverside Police Department for 3 years, but nothing had prepared her for the calls that started coming in during the winter of 2019. It began on a Tuesday night in February, around 2:47 a.m., when the dispatch phone rang with what seemed like a routine disturbance call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost eerily so. A man, speaking in measured tones, reported a suspicious individual walking through the Maple Grove neighborhood. He provided an exact address, described the person's clothing down to the last detail, and even mentioned which direction they were headed. Sarah dispatched a unit to check it out, thinking nothing unusual about the call. 20 minutes later, officers Jim Rodriguez and Kelly Thompson radioed back with an update that made Sarah's blood run cold. They had found exactly what the caller described: a man in a dark hoodie and jeans, carrying a crowbar, attempting to break into a house at the precise location given. The would-be burglar was arrested without incident, but something about the call didn't sit right with Sarah. How had the anonymous caller known such specific details? The timing was too perfect. The calls continued over the next several weeks, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always from the same calm voice. Each time, the man would report criminal activity with impossible accuracy. He would describe ongoing drug deals, providing not just locations, but the number of people involved, their vehicle descriptions, and even license plate numbers. Every single tip panned out exactly as described. Detective Marcus Webb became involved after the 5th call resulted in a major drug bust. The anonymous caller had described a methamphetamine operation happening in real time at an abandoned warehouse on Industrial Boulevard. When the tactical team arrived, they found everything exactly as the caller had detailed, down to the color of the plastic containers being used to cook the drugs. "This guy has to be watching these crimes happen," Webb told Sarah during a briefing. "But how is he everywhere at once? And why doesn't he just call 911 like a normal person?" The calls always came through the main dispatch line, and attempts to trace them led nowhere. The caller used different phone numbers each time, all linked to prepaid phones that were immediately discarded after use. Voice analysis revealed nothing unusual. No accent, no speech impediments, just that same unnaturally calm delivery that never wavered, even when describing violent crimes in progress. Things took a darker turn in March, when the caller began describing crimes before they happened. The first incident occurred on a rainy Thursday night. At 2:23 a.m., the voice called to report a domestic violence situation that will escalate to attempted murder at 1847 Pine Street. The caller provided the names of both individuals involved, Robert Chen and his estranged wife, Lisa, and stated that Robert would arrive at Lisa's apartment with a knife at approximately 3:15 a.m. Sarah hesitated before dispatching units. How could someone predict a crime that hadn't happened yet? But something in the caller's tone convinced her to send officers anyway. At exactly 3:12 a.m., Robert Chen was arrested in the parking lot of 1847 Pine Street, carrying a 8-inch kitchen knife and a bottle of whiskey. Lisa Chen later told police she had been expecting him to show up, as he had been making threats all week. The predictive calls became more frequent and more disturbing. The caller would describe accidents before they occurred, providing exact times and locations. On March 18th, he called to report that a drunk driver in a red pickup truck would crash into the guardrail on Highway 94 at mile marker 23 at 3:41 a.m. Officers were positioned nearby, and at 3:41 a.m. exactly, they watched a red Ford F-150 slam into the guardrail. The driver, heavily intoxicated, survived with minor injuries. Detective Webb became obsessed with identifying the caller. He spent hours reviewing traffic cameras, looking for patterns, trying to figure out how someone could be in multiple locations simultaneously. The caller seemed to have eyes everywhere, knowing things that were impossible for any single person to know. The breakthrough came when the caller made his first mistake. During a call in late March describing a convenience store robbery, Sarah heard something in the background, the faint sound of police radio chatter. It was barely audible, but she was certain she heard her own voice dispatching units to the very crime the caller was describing. Webb immediately pulled the phone records and cross-referenced them with officer locations during each call. The pattern that emerged was terrifying. Every single anonymous call had originated from within a 3-block radius of wherever Officer Danny Morrison was positioned at the time. Morrison was a 12-year veteran of the force, well-respected and never subject to any disciplinary action. When Webb confronted him, Morrison initially denied everything, but when presented with the phone evidence and the radio background noise, he broke down completely. The truth was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Morrison suffered from severe insomnia and had been taking prescription stimulants to stay alert during night shifts. The medication, combined with stress and sleep deprivation, had triggered a rare psychological condition called dissociative identity disorder. During his episodes, Morrison would essentially become a different person, one who observed crimes and reported them as if he were a concerned citizen rather than a police officer. The predictive aspect of the calls was even more unsettling. Morrison had been unconsciously profiling potential criminals during his patrols, picking up on behavioral cues and situational factors that his conscious mind hadn't processed. His altered state would then compile these observations into accurate predictions of when and where crimes would occur. What made the case truly frightening was that Morrison had no memory of making the calls. When investigators played back the recordings, he didn't recognize his own voice. The calm, measured tone was completely different from his normal speaking pattern. It was as if a completely different person had been inhabiting his body during those late-night hours. Morrison was immediately placed on administrative leave and ordered to undergo psychological evaluation. The department quietly reassigned several cases that might have been compromised by his involvement, but the damage went deeper than just procedural concerns. For weeks afterward, Sarah found herself questioning every anonymous tip that came through dispatch. When the phone rang during those early morning hours, she would freeze, wondering if the calm voice on the other end was really trying to help, or if something far more sinister was at play. The most disturbing part was that Morrison's predictions had been remarkably accurate. Even in his dissociative state, he had prevented numerous crimes and potentially saved lives. It raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of intuition, mental illness, and the thin line between helping and haunting. The case was eventually sealed, and Morrison was quietly transferred to a day shift position after extensive therapy. But those who worked the night shift during that winter of 2019 never forgot the feeling of picking up the phone at 2 a.m. and hearing that unnaturally calm voice, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching crimes unfold with impossible precision. To this day, Sarah Martinez checks the caller ID on every anonymous tip, and she still gets chills when she hears that particular tone of voice. Calm, measured, and far too knowing for comfort. Deputy Michael Torres thought he was getting a good deal when he bought the used police cruiser at the county auction in September 2018. The 2015 Ford Explorer had low mileage, a clean interior, and came fully equipped with all the radio gear still intact. What he didn't know was that the previous owner, Deputy Frank Kellerman, had died of a heart attack while on duty just 3 months earlier, right there in the driver's seat of that same vehicle. Torres worked the overnight shift for the Oakwood County Sheriff's Department, patrolling the rural highways and back roads that stretched for miles through farmland and sparse residential areas. The job was mostly quiet. The occasional drunk driver, domestic disturbance calls, or teenagers causing trouble at the old grain elevator. It was exactly the kind of peaceful assignment Torres wanted after transferring from the chaotic urban precinct where he'd worked for 5 years. The radio problems started during his second week on the job. It began with brief bursts of static that would interrupt normal dispatch communications. Torres initially assumed it was interference from the cell tower construction happening near the county line. He reported the issue to the communications department, and they assured him they'd look into it. But the static episodes became more frequent and started forming patterns. Late at night, usually between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., Torres would hear fragmented voices coming through the radio speakers. The transmissions were garbled and difficult to understand, but they sounded like police codes and dispatch chatter. The strange part was that none of the other units on duty reported hearing these transmissions, and dispatch had no record of them. On October 12th, during a routine patrol of Highway 67, Torres heard something that made him pull over to the side of the road. Through the static, he could clearly make out a voice saying, "Unit 47, responding to disturbance at Miller Farm, Route 23. The voice was faint, but distinct, and the call sign, Unit 47, was Frank Kellerman's old designation, the same number that had been retired after his death. Torres immediately radioed dispatch to ask if there were any active calls on Route 23. Dispatcher Carol Jensen confirmed that all units were accounted for and there were no current calls in that area. When Torres asked about Unit 47, there was a long pause before Jensen replied that the call sign had been decommissioned months ago. The transmissions became more frequent and more detailed. Torres would hear full conversations between Unit 47 and dispatch, discussing locations he recognized, but calls that weren't actually happening. The voice always sounded like it was coming from far away, as if transmitted through some kind of atmospheric distortion. What made it truly unsettling was the accuracy of the information. On October 20th, Torres heard the Phantom Unit 47 report a vehicle fire on County Road 15, near the old Hendricks place. 20 minutes later, a real emergency call came in about a car that had caught fire at that exact location. The timing was impossible. The phantom transmission had occurred before the actual incident. Torres began documenting every strange transmission he heard, noting the time, location, and content of each message. He discovered that the Phantom Unit 47 was always reporting real events, but consistently 15 to 30 minutes before they actually occurred. It was as if someone was broadcasting from the future, warning about incidents that hadn't happened yet. The communications department ran diagnostics on Torres's radio equipment multiple times, but found nothing wrong. The radio was functioning perfectly on all frequencies. They even replaced the entire unit, but the phantom transmissions continued. Other deputies who borrowed the vehicle reported hearing nothing unusual, which only added to Torres's growing anxiety about his mental state. The situation escalated on November 3rd, when Torres heard Unit 47 report a code blue medical emergency at 1247 Elm Street, elderly male, possible cardiac arrest. The transmission was crystal clear, more distinct than any of the previous ones. Torres immediately drove to the address, a small house where 78-year-old Walter Gaines lived alone. When Torres arrived, he found Gaines conscious and alert, working in his garden. The old man was confused about why a deputy had shown up at his house, insisting he felt fine and hadn't called for help. Torres felt foolish but decided to stay and chat with Gaines for a few minutes, just to be safe. 18 minutes later, Gaines clutched his chest and collapsed, Torres immediately called for an ambulance and began CPR. Gaines survived, and doctors later confirmed he had suffered a massive heart attack. If Torres hadn't been there, the elderly man would have died alone in his garden. Word of the incident spread quickly through the small department. Some colleagues praised Torres for his incredible intuition, while others began to whisper about his mental stability. The stress of the situation was taking its toll on Torres, who had begun to dread going to work, knowing he would hear the phantom voice of a dead colleague, predicting tragedies he was powerless to prevent. The breaking point came on November 15th, during a particularly clear transmission. Torres heard Unit 47 report a fatal accident on Highway 92, single vehicle rollover, young female driver, no survivors. The voice sounded different this time, more urgent, more emotional. For the first time, Torres thought he could hear genuine fear in the phantom deputy's voice. Torres raced toward Highway 92, his heart pounding. He found the stretch of road empty and peaceful under the moonlight. He parked on the shoulder and waited, checking his watch every few minutes. At 2:47 a.m., exactly 23 minutes after the phantom transmission, he saw headlights approaching from the north. A small sedan was traveling far too fast for the winding road. Torres could see the car weaving slightly, and he immediately activated his emergency lights and pulled out to attempt a traffic stop. The vehicle slowed and pulled over safely. The driver was a 19-year-old college student who had been driving home from a late shift at a restaurant. She was exhausted and admitted she had been nodding off at the wheel. Torres followed the young woman to the next town to ensure she made it safely to a hotel for the night. There was no accident, no rollover, no fatality. For the first time since the transmissions began, the Phantom Unit 47 had been wrong, or rather, Torres had managed to prevent the predicted tragedy from occurring. After that night, the transmissions gradually became less frequent and more faint. By December, Torres could barely make out the phantom voice through the static. The last clear transmission he heard was on December 23rd. Unit 47, end of watch. All units, stay safe out there. The radio fell completely silent after that. No more static, no more phantom voices, no more predictions. The communications department confirmed that all radio traffic had returned to normal. It was as if whatever had been trying to communicate through the radio waves had finally found peace. Torres later learned more about Frank Kellerman from older deputies who had worked with him. Kellerman had been known for his uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time, preventing accidents and saving lives through what seemed like pure intuition. He had been beloved by the community and respected by his colleagues for his dedication to protecting others. The official explanation for the radio anomalies was atmospheric interference, combined with old equipment picking up delayed transmissions from other jurisdictions. But Torres knew what he had experienced went beyond any technical explanation. Something had been trying to help him, guiding him to people who needed assistance, even after death. Torres kept the documentation of every phantom transmission, but he never spoke publicly about what happened. He continued working the night shift, but now he drove with a sense of purpose, knowing that sometimes the most important calls come from the most unexpected sources. And on quiet nights, when the radio was still and the highways were empty, he would sometimes whisper, "Thank you, Unit 47," into the darkness, hoping that somewhere in the static between frequencies, someone was listening. Sergeant Lisa Chen had always been a stickler for technology. When the Millbrook Police Department upgraded their dashcam systems in March 2020, she was among the first to request the newest model for her patrol vehicle. The HD 4000 series came with night vision, 360-degree recording, and automatic upload capabilities that would sync footage to the central server every time she returned to the station. What Chen didn't expect was for the camera to start recording things that hadn't happened yet. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday evening in April. Chen was reviewing footage from her previous shift, looking for evidence related to a traffic stop she'd made earlier that day. As she scrolled through the timeline on her computer, she noticed something odd. At timestamp 14:32:17, the camera had recorded her vehicle parked outside Murphy's Diner on Main Street, but she distinctly remembered being at the courthouse at that time, not at the diner. In the footage, she could see herself getting out of the patrol car and entering the diner. The video quality was crystal clear, showing her uniform, her badge number, even her facial expressions. But the timestamp was wrong. She had been at Murphy's Diner the following day at exactly 14:32, not the day the footage was supposedly recorded. Chen initially assumed it was a technical glitch with the timestamp feature. She reported the issue to the IT department, but they found no problems with the camera's internal clock or the recording system. The timestamp matched the server logs perfectly, suggesting the footage had indeed been recorded when the system said it was. The anomalies continued over the following weeks, always following the same pattern. The dashboard camera would record Chen's activities exactly 24 hours before they actually occurred. She would review footage and see herself responding to calls, conducting traffic stops, and patrolling areas she hadn't visited yet. Then, inevitably, she would find herself doing exactly what the camera had already recorded, often without consciously remembering that she had seen it in the footage. The phenomenon became more unsettling when the camera began recording incidents that involved other people. On May 8th, Chen reviewed footage that showed her responding to a domestic disturbance at 1247 Oak Street. In the video, she could see herself talking to a distraught woman named Patricia Williams, who was explaining that her husband had become violent after losing his job. The footage showed Chen calming the situation and arranging for Williams to stay with relatives. The problem was that Chen had never been to 1247 Oak Street, and she had never met Patricia Williams. But the next day, at the exact time shown in the footage, she received a dispatch call to respond to a domestic disturbance at that precise address. Everything unfolded exactly as the camera had recorded it, down to the woman's tearful explanation and Chen's decision to help her find temporary housing. Chen began experiencing severe anxiety about her job. She would watch the footage each night, seeing herself handle situations that felt like déjà vu when they actually occurred. It was as if she was living her life twice, once through the camera's prophetic recordings, and again in reality. The psychological strain was enormous, but she couldn't bring herself to report the incidents to her supervisors. Who would believe that a dashboard camera was predicting the future? The situation took a darker turn when the camera recorded a footage that showed Chen responding to a fatal accident. In the video, dated May 23rd, she arrived at the intersection of Highway 34 and County Road 12 to find a devastating collision between a school bus and a delivery truck. The footage showed multiple casualties, including several children, and Chen's obvious distress as she coordinated the emergency response. Chen watched this footage on May 22nd, knowing that if the pattern held, the accident would occur the next day. For the first time since the anomalies began, she felt she might be able to change the outcome. She spent the entire night planning how to prevent the tragedy, studying the footage for details about timing and circumstances. The next morning, Chen positioned herself near the intersection an hour before the accident was supposed to occur. She contacted the school district and the delivery company, claiming she had received intelligence about potential hazards in the area. The school agreed to alter the bus route, and the delivery company delayed their driver's departure. At the exact time the accident was supposed to happen, Chen watched as the school bus traveled safely down an alternative route, while the delivery truck arrived at the intersection 30 minutes later. The collision never occurred. For the first time, the camera's prediction had been wrong, or rather, Chen had successfully changed the future it had recorded. But the victory was short-lived. That evening, when Chen reviewed the new footage, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The camera had recorded new footage for May 24th, showing her at the same intersection, but this time the accident involved different vehicles, a passenger car and a motorcycle. The riders were younger, a couple who looked like college students. The footage showed Chen performing CPR on the motorcycle rider while screaming for medical assistance. Chen realized with growing horror that preventing one tragedy had simply caused the camera to record a different one. It was as if fate was determined to claim victims at that intersection, and the camera was showing her all the possible ways it could happen. Each time she intervened, new footage would appear, showing alternative disasters. Over the next week, Chen found herself trapped in a nightmare loop. She would prevent one accident, only to have the camera show her another. The intersection became a focal point of her obsession. She began parking there during her shifts, watching for any signs of potential danger. Her colleagues started to worry about her mental state, noticing her erratic behavior and her fixation on that particular stretch of road. The breaking point came on May 30th, when Chen reviewed footage that showed her own death. In the video, she was standing in the middle of the intersection, apparently trying to stop traffic, when a speeding vehicle struck her. The footage showed her body being thrown several feet, and the timestamp indicated it would happen during her next shift. Chen stared at the screen, watching her own final moments over and over. The detail was horrifying. She could see the terror in her own eyes as she realized the vehicle wasn't going to stop. The footage showed her colleagues arriving to find her lifeless body, and the grief on their faces was unmistakably real. For the first time since the anomalies began, Chen made a different choice. Instead of trying to prevent what the camera had recorded, she called in sick for her next shift. She stayed home, far from the intersection, and waited to see what would happen. The next day, she learned that there had indeed been an accident at the intersection during the time she was supposed to be there. A deer had wandered into the road, causing a vehicle to swerve and strike a utility pole. The driver survived with minor injuries, but the impact had taken down several power lines. If Chen had been standing in the intersection as the footage showed, she would have been electrocuted by the falling lines. After that incident, the camera's recordings returned to normal. The footage now showed only what had actually happened, not what was going to happen. Chen never determined whether the camera had been malfunctioning, or if some other force had been trying to communicate with her through the technology. She eventually transferred to a different department, unable to shake the feeling that the camera was still watching, still recording. The HD 4000 unit was reassigned to another officer, who reported no unusual activity. Chen kept the documentation of the strange footage, but she never spoke about what had happened. Sometimes, late at night, Chen would wonder if the camera had been trying to help her or trap her. Had it been showing her the future so she could change it? Or had it been forcing her to live through traumatic events twice? The question haunted her, because she realized that in trying to prevent tragedies, she had become part of them. To this day, Chen avoids dashboard cameras and refuses to review footage from her patrol vehicle. She has learned to trust her instincts over technology, knowing that sometimes the most advanced systems can show us things we were never meant to see. And whenever she passes an intersection, she can't help but wonder if somewhere, in some timeline, a camera is recording what happens next. Officer Jake Morrison had been patrolling the rural highways outside Pinewood for nearly 2 years when the department upgraded their GPS navigation systems in August 2021. The new units were supposed to be state-of-the-art, with real-time traffic updates, emergency routing protocols, and integration with the dispatch system. What Morrison didn't expect was for his GPS to start giving him directions to places that didn't exist. The first incident happened on a foggy Thursday night in September. Morrison was responding to a welfare check at 428 Riverside Drive when his GPS suddenly recalculated the route. Instead of the familiar path through downtown Pinewood, the device directed him to turn left onto Mill Creek Road, then right onto something called Hollowbrook Lane. Morrison had lived in the area his entire life and had never heard of Hollowbrook Lane, but the GPS showed it clearly on the map display. Trusting the technology, Morrison followed the directions. The road was narrow and poorly maintained, winding through dense forest that seemed darker than usual. After driving for nearly 15 minutes, he realized he was completely lost. The GPS showed him progressing along his route, but the landscape around him looked nothing like the area he knew. When he tried to radio his location to dispatch, he got only static. Morrison eventually turned around and found his way back to the main road, but the experience left him unsettled. When he finally arrived at 428 Riverside Drive, he was 45 minutes late. The homeowner, Mrs. Patterson, was confused about why police had been called to her house. She insisted she hadn't contacted anyone and was perfectly fine. Dispatch had no record of any welfare check request for that address. The GPS anomalies continued over the following weeks, but Morrison began to notice a pattern. The device would only give him strange directions when he was responding to calls that turned out to be false alarms or phantom requests. Whenever he followed the GPS to these mysterious locations, he would find himself in unfamiliar areas that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight, regardless of the actual time of day. On October 3rd, Morrison received a dispatch call about a stolen vehicle spotted on Highway 67. His GPS immediately began routing him toward an area called Millstone Valley, which, according to the map, was accessible via a series of back roads Morrison had never seen before. This time, he decided to ignore the GPS and take the route he knew would lead to Highway 67. When he arrived at the actual location, he found the stolen vehicle exactly where the dispatcher had indicated. The car was abandoned, and the suspects were nowhere to be found. But as Morrison processed the scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened while he was taking the correct route instead of following the GPS. The next morning, Morrison reviewed the incident report and discovered something disturbing. According to the timestamps, the stolen vehicle had been recovered at 10:47 p.m., but dispatch records showed that Morrison had radioed in his arrival at 10:52 p.m. There was a 5-minute gap that Morrison couldn't account for. His patrol car's odometer showed he had driven 23 additional miles during that time, but he had no memory of those miles. Morrison began keeping a detailed log of every time his GPS malfunctioned, noting the phantom destinations and the circumstances surrounding each incident. He discovered that the mysterious locations all had names that sounded historical: Millstone Valley, Hollowbrook Lane, Ironwood Crossing, Copper Ridge Path. When he researched these names at the local library, he found them mentioned in 19th century maps and documents, but they were areas that had been flooded when the county built a reservoir in 1967. The most disturbing incident occurred on October 18th, when Morrison received a call about a missing child. 8-year-old Tommy Brennan had wandered away from his family's campsite at Pine Lake State Park. Morrison's GPS immediately began directing him toward Whispering Pines Trail. a route that led deep into the forest preserve. Despite his growing distrust of the device, Morrison felt compelled to follow the directions. The trail was barely wide enough for his patrol car, and the canopy of trees blocked out most of the daylight. As he drove deeper into the woods, he began hearing something that made his blood run cold, the faint sound of a child crying. Morrison stopped the car and listened carefully. The crying seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead, just beyond the next bend in the trail. He grabbed his flashlight and radio and continued on foot. The sound grew louder and more distinct, definitely a young boy's voice calling for help. Following the sound, Morrison found himself in a small clearing where the crying seemed to be coming from all directions at once. He called out, identifying himself as a police officer, but the crying continued without any response to his voice. The sound was heartbreaking, a child in obvious distress, but somehow Morrison couldn't pinpoint the exact location. As Morrison searched the clearing, he noticed something that made him question his sanity. The trees around the perimeter were scarred with what looked like old axe marks, and the ground was covered with rotting wooden posts that might have once been part of a fence or structure. This looked like the remnants of a settlement, but according to official records, this forest had been undisturbed wilderness for over a century. The crying suddenly stopped, leaving Morrison alone in the unnatural silence of the clearing. He tried to radio his location to dispatch, but his radio produced only static. His GPS showed him as being miles from where he thought he was, in an area marked simply as Restricted Zone on the map display. Morrison made his way back to his vehicle and drove out of the forest as quickly as possible. When he finally reached an area where his radio worked, he contacted dispatch to report his location and request backup for the search. The dispatcher informed him that Tommy Brennan had been found safe at the campsite 20 minutes earlier. He had simply been hiding in his family's tent, playing a game. That night, Morrison researched the area where he had been led by the GPS. He discovered that Whispering Pines had indeed been a small logging settlement in the 1800s, but it had been abandoned after a tragic fire that killed several children. The settlement had been forgotten until it was flooded along with the rest of the valley when the reservoir was built. Morrison began to suspect that his GPS wasn't malfunctioning at all. It was somehow tapped into historical data, showing him locations that had existed decades or even centuries ago. The device seemed to be responding to emotional residue from past tragedies, leading him to places where people had once needed help but never received it. The final incident occurred on November 1st, when Morrison received a call about a domestic disturbance. His GPS directed him to Meadowview Cottage via a route that took him through farmland he had never seen before. The house, when he found it, was a small white cottage with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under the windows. It looked perfectly maintained, but something about it felt wrong. Morrison approached the front door and knocked, but there was no answer. He could hear voices inside, a man and woman arguing loudly. When he looked through the windows, he saw the interior of the house, but the furniture and decor looked like they were from the 1950s. The people inside were dressed in clothing from that era, and their arguments seemed to be about money troubles and job prospects. As Morrison watched, the scene suddenly shifted. The house was now empty and covered in dust, with broken windows and peeling paint. The voices stopped, and Morrison realized he was looking at an abandoned building that had been empty for decades. When he checked his GPS, it showed him standing in the middle of an empty field with no structure in sight. Morrison never reported the cottage incident to his supervisors. He realized that the GPS was somehow showing him glimpses of the past, moments of human drama and tragedy that had occurred in locations that no longer existed in the present. The device seemed to be responding to his role as a police officer, leading him to situations where help had been needed but never arrived. After that night, Morrison requested a transfer to a different patrol area and refused to use the GPS system. He learned to rely on his knowledge of the roads and his instincts rather than technology that couldn't distinguish between past and present. The GPS unit was reassigned to another officer who reported no unusual activity. Morrison kept his log of the phantom destinations, but he never shared it with anyone. He had learned that some technology can access information that was never meant to be accessed, and some calls for help echo across time, waiting for someone to finally respond. The question that haunted him was whether he had been helping past victims find peace, or whether they had been trying to warn him about something that was yet to come. To this day, Morrison avoids using GPS devices and prefers to navigate by memory and instinct. He knows that the fastest route isn't always the right one, and sometimes the places we're led to exist only in the spaces between what was and what is. And on quiet nights, when the radio is silent and the roads are empty, he sometimes wonders if somewhere in the digital networks that connect our world, the voices of the past are still calling for help. Detective Amanda Walsh had always been skeptical of the department's new body camera requirements, but after the incident at Riverside Elementary School in October 2022, she became a firm believer in documenting everything. What she didn't expect was for her camera to start recording things that no one else could see. Walsh worked for the Cedar Falls Police Department, specializing in cases involving children and families. The body camera was standard issue, a compact device that clipped to her uniform and recorded everything from her perspective. The footage was automatically uploaded to secure servers and could be reviewed by supervisors or used as evidence in court proceedings. The anomalies began during a routine visit to check on the welfare of 6-year-old Emma Rodriguez. The girl's teacher had reported that Emma seemed withdrawn and had been drawing disturbing pictures during art class. When Walsh arrived at the family's apartment, everything appeared normal. Emma's mother, Maria, was cooperative and concerned, and the apartment was clean and well maintained. Walsh interviewed Emma in her bedroom, a typical little girl's room with pink walls, stuffed animals, and drawings taped to the walls. The conversation was standard. Walsh asked about school, friends, and how Emma felt at home. The girl seemed shy but responsive, giving no indication of abuse or neglect. When Walsh reviewed the body camera footage later that evening, she noticed something that made her rewind the video several times. At timestamp 14:23:17, as she was talking to Emma, there appeared to be someone else in the room. The camera had captured the shadow of a tall figure standing in the corner behind Emma's bed, but Walsh distinctly remembered being alone with the child. The shadow was clearly visible on the footage, a dark silhouette that seemed to be watching the conversation. What was most disturbing was that the shadow appeared to be moving slightly, as if it were a living person trying to stay hidden. Walsh had seen nothing with her own eyes during the interview, but the camera had recorded something that shouldn't have been there. Walsh initially assumed it was a technical glitch or a trick of the lighting. She reported the anomaly to the IT department, but they found no issues with the camera or the footage. The video file was clean, with no signs of corruption or digital artifacts. According to their analysis, the shadow was part of the original recording. The incidents continued over the following weeks, always during interviews with children. Walsh's body camera would record figures that she couldn't see with her naked eye. Dark shapes lurking in doorways, shadows moving across walls, and occasionally what appeared to be adult figures standing behind or near the children she was interviewing. The pattern became more disturbing when Walsh noticed that the mysterious figures only appeared in cases where she later discovered evidence of abuse or neglect. During a visit to check on 9-year-old Marcus Thompson, her camera recorded a tall shadow looming over the boy throughout their conversation. Marcus appeared nervous and gave inconsistent answers about injuries on his arms. 2 weeks later, Walsh arrested Marcus's stepfather for child abuse after the boy finally disclosed the truth about his home situation. Walsh began reviewing all her body camera footage meticulously, looking for patterns in the shadow appearances. She discovered that the figures seemed to be protective rather than threatening. In the footage, they would position themselves between Walsh and the children, or stand behind the children as if shielding them from harm. The shadows never moved aggressively or appeared menacing. Instead, they seemed to be guardians of some kind. The most significant incident occurred during a case involving 7-year-old Sophie Chen, whose grandmother had reported concerns about the child's behavior after visits with her father. When Walsh interviewed Sophie at her grandmother's house, the girl was initially reluctant to talk. The body camera footage later revealed something extraordinary. As Sophie struggled to find words to describe her experiences, the camera recorded what appeared to be a woman kneeling beside the child, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The figure was clearer than any of the previous shadows. Walsh could make out the shape of a dress, long hair, and gentle gestures. The mysterious woman seemed to be encouraging Sophie to speak, and moments later, the child began to disclose the abuse she had been suffering. Walsh was stunned when she reviewed the footage. She had been alone with Sophie and the grandmother, but the camera had captured a fourth person in the room. The woman's presence seemed to give Sophie the courage to reveal the truth about her father's behavior, leading to his arrest and Sophie's protection. As Walsh continued to investigate, she began to notice something else in the footage. The shadowy figures often appeared to be wearing clothing from different time periods. Some wore what looked like Victorian-era dresses. Others appeared to be in clothing from the 1940s or 1950s. It was as if the camera was picking up the presence of people from different generations, all united by a common purpose: protecting children. The realization that troubled Walsh most was that the figures seemed to know things about the cases that she hadn't yet discovered. In the footage, they would gesture toward areas where evidence would later be found, or position themselves near children who would eventually disclose abuse. It was as if they were trying to guide her investigation, showing her what she needed to see to protect the vulnerable children in her care. Walsh began researching the history of the locations where the shadows appeared. She discovered that many of the homes and buildings had tragic histories involving children. Emma Rodriguez's apartment building had been constructed on the site of an old orphanage that had burned down in 1934, killing 12 children. Marcus Thompson's house had previously been owned by a family whose daughter had died under suspicious circumstances in 1987. The most compelling discovery came when Walsh investigated Sophie Chen's grandmother's house. The property had been owned by a woman named Margaret Whitfield in the 1920s. Margaret had been a social worker who devoted her life to protecting abused children, often taking them into her own home when the authorities failed to act. She had died in 1928, but local records showed she had saved dozens of children from dangerous situations. When Walsh compared Margaret's photograph from historical records to the figure captured on her body camera, the resemblance was unmistakable. The woman who had appeared to comfort Sophie looked exactly like Margaret Whitfield, down to the style of dress and the way she wore her hair. Walsh realized that her body camera was somehow recording the presence of people who had dedicated their lives to protecting children, even after death. The device seemed to be sensitive to some kind of emotional residue or spiritual energy that lingered in places where children had been in danger. The shadows and figures were drawn to situations where their help was needed, just as they had been in life. The phenomenon reached its peak during a case involving multiple children at a daycare center. Walsh's camera recorded what appeared to be an entire group of protective figures surrounding the children during interviews. The footage showed men and women of various ages, all positioned defensively around the kids, as if forming a barrier against harm. The children, unaware of the invisible guardians, seemed calmer and more willing to speak about their experiences. As word of Walsh's unusual footage spread quietly through the department, other officers began reporting similar experiences with their body cameras. The phenomenon seemed to be spreading, as if the protective spirits had found a way to make themselves visible through the technology that was supposed to document the truth. Walsh never spoke publicly about what her camera was recording, but she began to rely on the footage as guidance for her investigations. When the shadows appeared, she knew to look deeper into a case. When the figures positioned themselves in specific locations, she would search those areas for evidence. The invisible guardians had become her partners in protecting the children who needed help the most. The body camera that had started as a departmental requirement became Walsh's most valuable tool, not just for recording evidence, but for detecting the presence of those who had devoted their existence to safeguarding the innocent. She learned that some forms of protection transcend death, and that the most advanced technology can sometimes capture the oldest and most powerful force in the universe, the determination to shield children from harm. To this day, Walsh reviews every frame of her body camera footage, knowing that the shadows and figures she sees are not glitches or anomalies, but guardians who have found a way to continue their mission through the digital eyes of modern law enforcement. And in the quiet moments between cases, she whispers her thanks to the invisible army of protectors who help her see what others cannot. Officer Ryan Chambers thought he was getting lucky when he was assigned Unit 23, a nearly new Ford Interceptor that had just returned from the motor pool after extensive maintenance work. The previous officer, Sergeant David Murphy, had been driving it for 3 years before his retirement in June 2023. What Chambers didn't know was that Murphy hadn't exactly retired willingly. He had suffered a massive stroke while on duty and died behind the wheel of Unit 23. Chambers worked the late shift for the Westfield Police Department, patrolling the quiet suburban neighborhoods and commercial districts from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The job was mostly routine, responding to alarm calls, checking on businesses, and handling the occasional domestic disturbance. Unit 23 ran perfectly, with smooth acceleration, responsive brakes, and all the electronic systems functioning flawlessly. The first strange incident occurred during Chambers' second week on the job. He was responding to a burglar alarm at Morrison's hardware store when Unit 23 suddenly veered to the right, pulling into the parking lot of O'Malley's Bar without any input from Chambers. The steering wheel had turned on its own, and the vehicle had smoothly executed the turn, as if guided by an invisible hand. Chambers immediately stopped the car and checked the power steering system, thinking there might be a mechanical failure. Everything appeared normal, and when he tested the steering, it responded perfectly to his input. He attributed the incident to fatigue and continued to the hardware store, where he found a false alarm triggered by a malfunctioning sensor. Over the following weeks, Unit 23 began exhibiting more unusual behavior. The car would occasionally change lanes without Chambers touching the wheel, always moving toward locations where incidents were about to occur. On September 15th, the vehicle pulled itself into the parking lot of Westfield High School just as a fight broke out between students in the courtyard. Chambers hadn't received any radio calls about the disturbance, but he was perfectly positioned to intervene. The pattern became more noticeable as Chambers realized that Unit 23 seemed to anticipate emergency calls. The car would start moving toward locations several minutes before dispatch would radio him with assignments. It was as if the vehicle knew where trouble was brewing before anyone else did. Chambers began to trust the car's instincts, following its lead even when it contradicted his planned patrol route. The most dramatic incident occurred on October 3rd, when Unit 23 suddenly accelerated and began driving toward the industrial district without any input from Chambers. The car ignored his attempts to steer elsewhere, maintaining a steady course toward the old Riverside manufacturing plant. Chambers radioed dispatch to report his location, but they had no active calls in that area. As Unit 23 pulled into the plant's parking lot, Chambers saw smoke beginning to rise from one of the buildings. He immediately called in the fire, and within minutes, fire trucks arrived to battle what turned out to be a major electrical fire. The fire chief later told Chambers that if the fire had gone undetected for even 10 more minutes, it would have spread to the chemical storage area and potentially caused an explosion that could have been felt for miles. Chambers began to research the history of Unit 23 and learned about Sergeant Murphy's death. Murphy had been known throughout the department for his uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. Colleagues called it his sixth sense for trouble, and he had a reputation for preventing incidents before they became serious problems. He had worked the same patrol area for over a decade and knew every street, business, and potential trouble spot by heart. The realization that Murphy had died in the driver's seat of Unit 23 made Chambers uncomfortable, but he couldn't deny that the car's behavior was helping him be a more effective officer. The vehicle seemed to retain Murphy's knowledge of the patrol area, guiding Chambers to locations where his presence was needed most. The supernatural aspects of the situation became more apparent when Unit 23 began responding to calls that hadn't been made yet. On October 18th, the car pulled into the driveway of 1432 Elm Street and stopped directly in front of the house. Chambers sat in the vehicle for several minutes, wondering why he was there, when an elderly woman came running out of the house, screaming that her husband was having a heart attack. Chambers immediately called for an ambulance and administered CPR until paramedics arrived. The woman's husband survived, and doctors later said that the quick response had saved his life. When Chambers asked the woman if she had called 911, she explained that she had been too panicked to think clearly and hadn't made any calls. Somehow, Unit 23 had known help was needed before anyone had requested it. The car's behavior became more complex as it began making decisions about traffic enforcement. During routine patrols, Unit 23 would slow down or speed up to position itself near vehicles that were about to commit violations. The car seemed to sense when drivers were about to run red lights, make illegal turns, or drive under the influence. Chambers found himself making more arrests and preventing more accidents than any other officer in the department. The most unsettling incident occurred on November 7th, when Unit 23 began driving toward the Westfield Cemetery at 3 a.m. Chambers tried to override the car's direction, but the steering wheel felt locked in position. The vehicle drove itself through the cemetery gates and stopped in front of a specific headstone. When Chambers got out to investigate, he found himself standing at Sergeant Murphy's grave. The headstone was simple, bearing Murphy's name, dates of service, and the inscription, "Always on patrol." As Chambers stood there, he felt a presence in the car, as if someone was sitting in the passenger seat. When he looked back at Unit 23, he could see the interior dome light flickering in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. Chambers spent the rest of his shift researching Morse code and discovered that the light pattern spelled out, "Thank you." It was as if Murphy's spirit was acknowledging that his knowledge and experience were being put to good use, helping protect the community he had served for so many years. After the cemetery incident, Unit 23's behavior became less dramatic, but more consistent. The car would gently guide Chambers toward areas where his presence was needed, never forcing him to go anywhere, but offering subtle suggestions through minor adjustments in steering and acceleration. It was as if Murphy had learned to work with Chambers rather than simply taking control of the vehicle. Chambers began leaving small tokens of appreciation on the dashboard, a cup of coffee that he would pour out at the end of his shift, or a newspaper folded to the sports section, knowing that Murphy had been a devoted baseball fan. The car seemed to respond positively to these gestures, running even more smoothly and seeming more cooperative during patrols. Other officers in the department began noticing Chambers' unusually high success rate in preventing incidents and making arrests. When asked about his secret, Chambers would simply say that he had learned to trust his instincts and pay attention to his surroundings. He never mentioned Unit 23's supernatural assistance, knowing that such claims would be met with skepticism or concern about his mental state. The partnership between Chambers and the spirit of Unit 23 reached its peak during a major incident on December 2nd. The car began driving urgently toward the Westfield shopping center, ignoring Chambers' attempts to respond to other calls. When they arrived, Unit 23 positioned itself near the main entrance, just as a man with a weapon entered the mall. Chambers was able to apprehend the armed individual before anyone was hurt, but he later learned that the man had been planning to harm multiple people. The quick response prevented what could have been a tragic mass shooting. Security cameras later showed that Chambers had arrived at the mall 3 minutes before any 911 calls were made about the armed man. After that incident, Chambers realized that Murphy's spirit wasn't just helping him do his job. It was using their partnership to continue protecting the community that Murphy had served faithfully for over a decade. The car had become a vessel for Murphy's dedication to law enforcement, allowing him to continue his patrol duties even after death. Chambers still drives Unit 23, and he has learned to communicate with Murphy's presence through subtle changes in the car's behavior. A gentle pull to the left might suggest checking on a particular business, while a slight acceleration could indicate the need to respond more quickly to a call. It's a partnership that transcends life and death, united by a shared commitment to protecting and serving. To this day, Chambers begins each shift by placing his hand on the steering wheel and saying, "Ready for patrol, Sergeant?" The engine always responds with a subtle purr, and Unit 23 begins another night of keeping the streets of Westfield safe, guided by the spirit of an officer who refused to let death end his watch. Detective Nicole Harper had been managing the evidence storage facility for the Millfield Police Department for 6 months when she first noticed that items were moving on their own. The basement storage room was a maze of metal shelving units, each containing hundreds of evidence bags, boxes, and containers from cases dating back to the 1980s. What Harper didn't know was that the previous evidence custodian, Detective Ernest Kowalski, had spent 43 years organizing and protecting these items before his sudden death from a heart attack while working alone in the storage room. Harper's job was straightforward: catalog incoming evidence, maintain chain of custody documentation, and retrieve items when requested by detectives or attorneys. The storage facility was climate controlled and secured with multiple locks, cameras, and an electronic access system. Only authorized personnel could enter, and every visit was logged and monitored. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday morning in March 2023 when Harper arrived to find evidence box number 40472 sitting on her desk. The box contained items from a 1998 burglary case that had been solved and closed years ago. According to the digital inventory system, the box should have been on shelf unit C7, rack 12, position 23. Harper checked the location and found it empty, with no record of anyone accessing the storage room after hours. Harper assumed a colleague had pulled the box and forgotten to return it properly. She reshelved the evidence and made a note in the log, but the incident bothered her. The storage facility was her domain, and she prided herself on maintaining perfect organization. The idea that items could move without her knowledge was unsettling. Over the following weeks, Harper began finding evidence in unexpected locations. Boxes would appear on different shelves, bags would be grouped with unrelated cases, and items would migrate to areas where they didn't belong. The strange part was that the relocations weren't random. The evidence seemed to be organizing itself according to some logic that Harper couldn't understand. The pattern became clearer when Harper noticed that items from related cases were being grouped together, even when those connections weren't obvious in the official filing system. Evidence from burglaries committed by the same suspect would end up on the same shelf, even if the crimes had occurred years apart and the connection had never been made by investigators. On April 15th, Harper discovered something that made her question her sanity. She found evidence bags from 3 different unsolved break-ins arranged in chronological order on a shelf that should have contained drug seizure materials. When she researched the cases, she discovered that all 3 burglaries had been committed by the same person, but the connection had never been identified because they had occurred in different jurisdictions over a span of 5 years. Harper presented her findings to Detective Frank Rodriguez, who had been working one of the unsolved cases. Rodriguez was skeptical until Harper showed him the evidence arrangement and the pattern of stolen items. The burglar had a distinctive method and always took the same types of valuables. With the evidence properly connected, Rodriguez was able to identify and arrest the suspect within a week. The success encouraged Harper to pay closer attention to the mysterious evidence movements. She began documenting every instance where items appeared in unexpected locations, treating each occurrence as a potential clue. The evidence storage room seemed to have developed its own intelligence, connecting dots that human investigators had missed. The most dramatic incident occurred when Harper found a dusty evidence box from 1994 sitting prominently on her desk chair. The box contained items from the unsolved murder of Maria Santos, a case that had gone cold after exhausting all leads. Inside the box, Harper found the victim's jewelry, clothing fibers, and a partial fingerprint that had never been processed due to technology limitations at the time. What caught Harper's attention was that the evidence box was positioned next to a more recent robbery case file that had been left open on her desk. The robbery suspect had been fingerprinted during booking, and Harper noticed similarities between his prints and the partial print from the murder case. Advanced fingerprint analysis confirmed a match, leading to the arrest of Maria Santos's killer nearly 30 years after the crime. Harper began to suspect that someone or something was actively working to solve cold cases through strategic evidence placement. The movements were too purposeful and too accurate to be coincidence. It was as if an invisible detective was working through the night, connecting evidence and highlighting overlooked clues. Research into the storage facility's history revealed that Detective Kowalski had been legendary for his ability to connect seemingly unrelated cases. Colleagues called him the memory bank because he could recall details from cases spanning decades. Kowalski had an obsessive dedication to unsolved cases, often spending his own time reviewing old evidence and looking for connections that others had missed. Harper discovered that Kowalski had died while working on a particularly frustrating cold case. the disappearance of 16-year-old Jennifer Walsh in 2019. He had been found slumped over evidence boxes from the case, apparently having suffered a heart attack while reviewing the materials for the 100th time. His dedication to finding Jennifer had literally killed him. The revelation made Harper view the evidence movements differently. Rather than being disturbed by the supernatural activity, she began to see it as a continuation of Kowalski's work. His spirit seemed to be using his encyclopedic knowledge of the cases to guide her towards solutions that living investigators had missed. Harper started leaving notebooks and pens near evidence that had been mysteriously relocated. In the morning, she would find handwritten notes in cramped, old-fashioned script, pointing out connections between cases or highlighting specific pieces of evidence that deserved closer examination. The handwriting matched samples of Kowalski's notes from active case files. The ghostly partnership reached its peak when Harper found every piece of evidence related to Jennifer Walsh's disappearance arranged in a perfect timeline on the main work table. The display included items that had never been officially connected to the case: a torn piece of fabric from a different investigation, a witness statement that had been misfiled, and a photograph that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Following Kowalski's posthumous guidance, Harper was able to piece together Jennifer's final movements and identify a suspect who had never been considered. The breakthrough led to the discovery of Jennifer's remains and the arrest of her killer, bringing closure to a case that had haunted Kowalski for the final years of his life. After solving Jennifer's case, the supernatural activity in the evidence storage room became less frequent, but more targeted. Kowalski's spirit seemed to focus on the most serious unsolved cases, particularly those involving missing persons and violent crimes. Harper learned to interpret the evidence movements as assignments, understanding that each mysterious relocation was directing her attention to cases that deserved fresh investigation. Other detectives began to notice Harper's unusual success rate in connecting cold cases and identifying overlooked evidence. When asked about her methods, Harper would simply say that she believed in being thorough and looking at cases from different perspectives. She never mentioned her supernatural partner, knowing that such claims would undermine her credibility. The evidence storage room became a place where past and present worked together to serve justice. Harper would arrive each morning to find new arrangements of evidence, knowing that Kowalski's spirit was still working the night shift, using his decades of experience to guide active investigations toward solutions. Harper developed a routine of speaking aloud to Kowalski while working, updating him on case developments and thanking him for his continued service. The storage room would respond with subtle signs, lights flickering in acknowledgement, doors closing gently, or the faint sound of papers rustling as if someone was taking notes. The partnership between Harper and Kowalski's spirit solved 17 cold cases over 2 years, bringing justice to victims and closure to families who had waited decades for answers. The evidence storage room became known throughout the department as a place where impossible connections were made and forgotten clues were rediscovered. Harper still manages the evidence facility, but now she sees herself as part of a team that transcends life and death. She maintains Kowalski's meticulous organizational standards while allowing his spirit to guide her toward the cases that need attention most. The storage room has become a sanctuary where the dedication to justice continues uninterrupted, proving that some commitments to truth and justice are stronger than death itself. To this day, Harper begins each shift by placing a fresh cup of coffee on Kowalski's old desk, now used for storage, but still bearing his nameplate. The coffee is always gone by morning, and new evidence arrangements appear like clockwork, reminding Harper that in the pursuit of justice, retirement is never really an option for those who truly believe in protecting and serving. Officer Ben Martinez thought he was receiving standard equipment when the Riverside Police Department issued him a new breathalyzer unit in November 2022. The Intoxilyzer 9000 was supposed to be the most advanced alcohol detection device available, featuring digital displays, wireless connectivity, and enhanced accuracy for court testimony. What Martinez didn't expect was for the device to start detecting things that had nothing to do with alcohol consumption, including the unmistakable scent of approaching death. Martinez worked traffic enforcement on Highway 34, a busy stretch of road known for drunk driving incidents, especially on weekends. The breathalyzer was an essential tool for his job, allowing him to gather evidence for DUI arrests and ensure public safety. He had used similar devices for years and was familiar with their operation and limitations. The first anomaly occurred during a routine traffic stop on a Friday night in late November. Martinez had pulled over a driver who was weaving between lanes and driving erratically. When he administered the breathalyzer test, the device displayed an alcohol reading of 0.00, but then showed a message that Martinez had never seen before. Anomalous substances detected. Caution advised. The driver, a middle-aged businessman named Robert Chen, appeared sober and coherent. He passed all field sobriety tests and showed no signs of impairment. Martinez was puzzled by the warning message, but since the alcohol reading was 0, he had no legal grounds to arrest Chen. He issued a warning for reckless driving and allowed the man to continue on his way. 3 hours later, Martinez received a radio call about a fatal accident on Highway 34. Robert Chen had crashed his vehicle into a tree at high speed, apparently after suffering a massive heart attack while driving. Emergency responders found prescription heart medication in Chen's car, suggesting he had been experiencing cardiac problems that may have affected his driving ability. Martinez realized that somehow the breathalyzer had detected Chen's medical condition before it became life-threatening. The device had sensed something in Chen's breath that indicated a serious health issue, even though it wasn't designed to detect anything other than alcohol. Over the following weeks, the breathalyzer continued to display unusual warnings during traffic stops. The messages varied: elevated stress indicators, metabolic irregularities detected, or chemical imbalance present. Martinez began documenting each incident, noting the warning messages and following up on the drivers when possible. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Drivers who triggered the unusual warnings often experienced medical emergencies within hours or days of the traffic stop. A woman who showed metabolic irregularities was hospitalized with diabetic ketoacidosis the next morning. A man with elevated stress indicators suffered a stroke 2 days later. Martinez began to suspect that the breathalyzer was detecting biomarkers in people's breath that indicated serious health conditions. The human breath contains hundreds of volatile compounds that can reveal information about a person's physical and mental state. Somehow, the device had become sensitive to these indicators, functioning as an early warning system for medical emergencies. The most dramatic incident occurred on December 15th, when Martinez stopped a young woman named Sarah Coleman for speeding. The breathalyzer reading was 0.00 for alcohol, but the device displayed a message that made Martinez's blood run cold. Immediate medical attention required. Contact emergency services. Coleman appeared perfectly healthy and insisted she felt fine. She was annoyed by the traffic stop and wanted to continue to her destination, but the breathalyzer's urgent warning convinced Martinez to call for an ambulance. When paramedics arrived and examined Coleman, they discovered she was in the early stages of a severe allergic reaction that could have become life-threatening without immediate treatment. Coleman was rushed to the hospital where doctors confirmed she was experiencing anaphylaxis triggered by a new medication she had taken earlier that day. If Martinez hadn't insisted on medical evaluation, Coleman would likely have gone into cardiac arrest while driving, potentially killing herself and other innocent people. Word of Martinez's unusual success in identifying medical emergencies spread through the department. Other officers began requesting to borrow his breathalyzer unit, but the device only produced standard alcohol readings when used by anyone else. The anomalous warnings only appeared when Martinez operated the device, suggesting that somehow he had developed a unique connection with the equipment. Martinez researched the breathalyzer's history and discovered that the unit had previously been assigned to Officer Patricia Vega, a traffic enforcement specialist who had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. Vega had been known for her compassionate approach to traffic stops and her ability to identify drivers who needed help rather than punishment. She had saved several lives by recognizing when traffic violations were caused by medical emergencies rather than impairment or recklessness. The revelation that Vega had died while using the same breathalyzer unit made Martinez wonder if her spirit was somehow influencing the device's readings. Vega had been passionate about protecting public safety and helping people in crisis. It seemed possible that her dedication to saving lives was continuing through the equipment she had used daily. Martinez began treating the breathalyzer warnings as medical alerts rather than equipment malfunctions. When the device indicated health concerns, he would engage drivers in conversation about their well-being and encourage them to seek medical attention. His approach was always helpful rather than punitive, focusing on the person's safety rather than traffic violations. The supernatural aspects of the situation became more apparent when the breathalyzer began displaying specific medical terminology in its warning messages. Instead of vague alerts, the device would show messages like cardiac arrhythmia detected or blood sugar crisis imminent. The specificity suggested that something with medical knowledge was influencing the readings. Martinez discovered that Officer Vega had been a trained EMT before joining the police force. She had extensive medical knowledge and had often served as an informal medical advisor for her colleagues. Her ability to recognize medical emergencies had been legendary within the department, and she had received several commendations for saving lives during routine traffic stops. The most unsettling discovery came when Martinez began to realize that the breathalyzer was detecting more than just immediate health crises. On December 28th, he stopped a young man named Kevin Walsh for erratic driving. The breathalyzer showed 0 alcohol, but displayed a message that chilled Martinez to the bone. Terminal condition detected. Time remaining critical. Walsh was a 23-year-old college student who appeared perfectly healthy and energetic. He was driving home from a New Year's party and seemed annoyed by the traffic stop. But the breathalyzer's warning was more urgent than any Martinez had seen before. When he suggested that Walsh should see a doctor immediately, the young man laughed it off, saying he felt better than he had in months. 3 days later, Martinez received a call from Walsh's family. Kevin had collapsed at home and been rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered an aggressive brain tumor that had been growing for months without symptoms. The cancer was so advanced that treatment options were extremely limited. Kevin Walsh died 6 weeks later, exactly as the breathalyzer had somehow predicted. This incident marked a turning point in Martinez's understanding of the device's capabilities. It wasn't just detecting existing medical emergencies. It was somehow sensing the approach of death itself, reading biological markers that indicated when someone's time was running short. The realization was both fascinating and terrifying. Martinez began keeping detailed records of every person who triggered the breathalyzer's most severe warnings. He discovered a disturbing pattern. Individuals who received terminal condition or time remaining critical Messages typically died within days or weeks of the traffic stop. The device seemed to be functioning as an inadvertent death detector, identifying people who were approaching the end of their lives, even when they appeared healthy. The psychological toll of this knowledge was enormous. Martinez found himself looking at seemingly healthy drivers and knowing, based on the breathalyzer's warnings, that they might not survive the month. He began struggling with whether he had a moral obligation to warn people about the device's predictions, even though doing so might cause unnecessary panic or be dismissed as the delusions of an unstable officer. The ethical dilemma deepened when Martinez stopped a middle-aged woman named Jennifer Park for a minor traffic violation. The breathalyzer produced its most urgent warning yet: immediate mortal danger, intervention required now. Park seemed perfectly fine, chatting pleasantly about her daughter's upcoming wedding and her plans for retirement. But the device's warning was so insistent that Martinez felt compelled to act. Martinez convinced Park to allow paramedics to examine her, claiming that he suspected she might be experiencing a medical emergency. The paramedics initially found nothing wrong, but Martinez's persistence led them to transport Park to the hospital for further evaluation. Emergency room doctors discovered that Park was in the early stages of a massive heart attack that would have killed her within hours if left untreated. Park's life was saved, but the incident raised troubling questions about the nature of the breathalyzer's abilities. How could a device designed to measure blood alcohol content detect impending death? What biological processes was it sensing that modern medical equipment couldn't identify until symptoms became apparent? Martinez's research into Officer Vega's background revealed even more disturbing information. Vega had not just been an EMT. She had worked in hospice care for several years before joining the police force. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when patients were approaching death, often knowing hours or even days before medical indicators became apparent. Colleagues had called it her death sense, and she had used this ability to help families prepare for their loved ones' final moments. The connection between Vega's deathbed vigils and the breathalyzer's terminal warnings suggested that her spirit was using the device to continue her work of preparing people for death, or in some cases, preventing it when intervention was still possible. The breathalyzer had become a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dying, guided by someone who had spent her career helping people navigate that transition. Martinez began approaching the breathalyzer's terminal warnings with the solemnity they deserved. When the device detected approaching death, he would find ways to encourage drivers to seek immediate medical attention or spend time with their families. He couldn't directly tell people they were dying, but he could create opportunities for early medical intervention or meaningful final moments with loved ones. The most heartbreaking case involved an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who triggered the breathalyzer's terminal warning during a routine traffic stop. Morrison was driving to visit his estranged son for the first time in 5 years, hoping to reconcile after a family dispute. The breathalyzer indicated that Morrison had only days to live. Martinez couldn't bring himself to interfere with Morrison's reunion plans, but he did suggest that the elderly man might want to make the most of his visit with his son. Morrison was puzzled by the advice, but promised to take it to heart. 2 days later, Morrison died peacefully in his sleep while staying at his son's house. The family later said that those final days of reconciliation had healed wounds that had been festering for years. These experiences taught Martinez that the breathalyzer's death predictions weren't always tragedies to be prevented. Sometimes they were opportunities for closure, healing, and peaceful endings. Vega's spirit seemed to understand the difference between deaths that could be prevented and those that needed to be accepted. guiding Martinez toward appropriate responses in each situation. The breathalyzer's abilities evolved to become even more sophisticated over time. Martinez noticed that the device began providing more specific information about the nature of approaching deaths. Messages like cardiac event imminent or neurological crisis developing gave him better guidance about what type of medical intervention might be helpful. The device seemed to be learning from each encounter, becoming more precise in its predictions. The most remarkable case occurred when Martinez stopped a car containing an entire family, parents and 3 young children, who were returning from a vacation. The breathalyzer produced readings for each family member, showing normal health indicators for everyone except the father, whose reading displayed genetic anomaly detected, hereditary risk factors present. Martinez's gentle suggestion that the family might want to schedule comprehensive medical checkups led to the discovery that the father carried a rare genetic mutation that predisposed him to sudden cardiac arrest. The condition was treatable with medication and lifestyle changes, but it was typically fatal when undiagnosed. The breathalyzer had essentially performed genetic testing through breath analysis, identifying a hereditary condition that could have killed the father at any time. As word of Martinez's uncanny ability to identify medical emergencies spread through the community, people began seeking him out for unofficial health screenings. Martinez was careful to explain that he was just a police officer with good instincts, but he couldn't deny the accuracy of the breathalyzer's medical warnings. The device had become an inadvertent public health tool, detecting diseases and conditions that conventional medicine might have missed for months or years. The partnership between Martinez and Vega's Spirit reached its pinnacle during a mass casualty event when a tour bus crashed on Highway 34. Multiple victims were scattered across the crash site, and medical resources were overwhelmed. Martinez used the breathalyzer to quickly triage victims, identifying those who needed immediate attention versus those who could wait for treatment. The device produced rapid-fire medical assessments as Martinez moved from victim to victim, highlighting internal injuries that weren't visible to paramedics and identifying patients who were in more critical condition than their external injuries suggested. The breathalyzer's supernatural medical knowledge helped save lives by ensuring that the most seriously injured victims received priority treatment. After that incident, Martinez realized that Vega's Spirit had transformed a simple alcohol detection device into a sophisticated medical diagnostic tool. The breathalyzer was no longer just police equipment. It had become a lifeline connecting the living to medical knowledge from beyond the grave, guided by someone who had devoted her existence to understanding the boundary between life and death. Other officers began referring drivers with potential medical issues to Martinez, knowing that his intuition about health problems was remarkably accurate. Martinez never explained the true source of his insights, but he developed a reputation as someone who could sense when traffic violations were symptoms of larger problems rather than simple recklessness. The partnership between Martinez and Vega's Spirit reached its peak during a multi-vehicle accident investigation. The breathalyzer began displaying rapid-fire warnings about multiple drivers at the scene, identifying those who needed immediate medical attention versus those who were simply shaken but uninjured. Martinez was able to prioritize emergency medical resources effectively, ensuring that the most critical patients received treatment first. The breathalyzer's medical warnings became less frequent over time, but more accurate when they did appear. It was as if Vega's Spirit had learned to focus on the most serious cases, conserving her energy for situations where her intervention could make the difference between life and death. Martinez still carries the same breathalyzer unit, and he has learned to trust its unusual warnings completely. He approaches each traffic stop, knowing that he might be dealing with more than just a traffic violation. He could be intercepting someone who desperately needs medical help, but doesn't realize it yet. The device has helped Martinez save over 30 lives in 2 years, transforming routine traffic enforcement into a form of mobile medical screening. He begins each shift by placing his hand on the breathalyzer and saying quietly, "Ready to help people, Officer Vega?" The device always responds with a brief flash of its display, as if acknowledging that another shift of protecting and serving is about to begin. To this day, Martinez views his breathalyzer not as a piece of equipment, but as a partner who brings decades of medical knowledge and life-saving experience to every traffic stop. He has learned that sometimes the most important readings are the ones that go beyond the device's original design, proving that dedication to saving lives can find ways to continue even after death. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez thought the electrical problems with her patrol unit were just another maintenance headache when the emergency light bar started malfunctioning in January 2024. The LED array would flash randomly while she was driving, activate without being turned on, and create light patterns that didn't match any of the programmed sequences. What Gonzalez didn't realize was that the lights were trying to communicate something far more important than equipment failure. Gonzalez supervised the evening shift for the Oakmont Police Department, patrolling a busy sector that included shopping centers, residential neighborhoods, and a stretch of Interstate 85 known for serious accidents. Her patrol unit was equipped with a top-of-the-line emergency lighting system featuring multiple LED bars, strobes, and directional warning lights designed to maximize visibility during emergency responses. The first unusual incident occurred during a routine patrol on January 18th. Gonzalez was driving through the Riverside shopping plaza when her emergency lights suddenly activated on their own, creating a rapid-fire sequence of red and blue flashes. She immediately turned off the system, but the lights continued to pulse in a specific pattern. 3 quick flashes, pause, 3 quick flashes, pause. The sequence repeated for nearly 2 minutes before finally stopping. Gonzalez pulled into a parking space to check the electrical connections, thinking there might be a short circuit or loose wire. As she was examining the light bar, she heard the screech of tires and a loud crash from the main road behind the shopping center. A drunk driver had run a red light and T-boned another vehicle at the intersection. If Gonzalez hadn't stopped to investigate her lights, she would have been driving through that same intersection at the exact moment of impact. Over the following weeks, the emergency lights continued to activate spontaneously, but Gonzalez began to notice they only malfunctioned in specific situations. The lights would start flashing when she was approaching areas where accidents were about to happen, almost as if they were trying to warn her to slow down or change course. The patterns varied, sometimes rapid strobing, sometimes alternating sequences, sometimes just a steady glow that shouldn't have been possible with the LED system. The most dramatic incident occurred on February 3rd, when Gonzalez was responding to a burglary call on Maple Street. As she approached the address, her emergency lights began flashing in a pattern she had never seen before. All the forward-facing lights went dark, while the rear-facing lights created a brilliant white strobe. The unusual display forced her to pull over and check the system. While Gonzalez was stopped, a speeding vehicle flew past her position and crashed into a utility pole 50 yards ahead. The driver had been fleeing the scene of the burglary and would have collided head-on with Gonzalez's patrol unit if she hadn't been forced to stop by the light malfunction. The crash was so severe that it killed the driver instantly and brought down power lines that would have electrocuted anyone in the impact zone. Gonzalez began documenting every light malfunction, noting the time, location, and circumstances surrounding each incident. She discovered that the emergency lights seemed to be predicting dangerous situations with remarkable accuracy. The system would activate 30 to 60 seconds before accidents, violence, or other hazardous events occurred in her vicinity. The phenomenon became more complex when the lights started creating directional patterns that seemed to guide Gonzalez away from danger or toward people who needed help. On February 15th, the rear lights began flashing, while the side lights created an arrow pattern pointing left. Following the light's guidance, Gonzalez turned into a residential neighborhood where she found an elderly man who had collapsed while shoveling snow. The man was having a heart attack, and Gonzalez's quick response saved his life. Research into her patrol unit's history revealed that the vehicle had previously been assigned to Officer James Park, a veteran police officer who had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. Park had been responding to an emergency call when a drunk driver ran a red light and struck his patrol car at high speed. He had died instantly, but his dedication to protecting others had been legendary throughout the department. Gonzalez learned that Park had been known for his uncanny ability to anticipate dangerous situations. Colleagues called him Radar because he seemed to sense trouble before it became visible. Park had prevented countless accidents and saved numerous lives through his proactive approach to patrol work and his intuitive understanding of traffic patterns and human behavior. The connection between Park's death and the light malfunctions became more apparent when Gonzalez noticed that the emergency lights would sometimes flash in Morse code. She decoded one sequence that spelled out "Caution ahead" just before she encountered a multi-vehicle pileup that had occurred minutes earlier on a foggy stretch of highway. The lights had warned her to slow down and activate her emergency equipment before she even saw the accident scene. The supernatural aspects of the situation reached their peak when the lights began displaying complex warning patterns that corresponded to specific types of dangers. A rapid red strobe meant traffic hazards, blue patterns indicated medical emergencies, and alternating red-blue sequences warned of violent situations. It was as if Park's spirit was using the emergency lighting system to continue his mission of protecting people on the roads he had patrolled for over 15 years. Gonzalez began trusting the light's warnings implicitly, treating each activation as a genuine alert rather than an equipment problem. When the lights warned of danger ahead, she would slow down and increase her vigilance. When they guided her in specific directions, she would follow their lead, often discovering people who needed assistance or dangerous situations that required police intervention. The most remarkable incident occurred on March 10th, when the emergency lights activated while Gonzalez was driving through a quiet residential area with no apparent hazards. The lights created a complex pattern that seemed to be directing her attention to a specific house. Following the guidance, Gonzalez stopped to investigate and heard faint cries for help coming from inside the home. She discovered an elderly woman who had fallen down a flight of stairs and been unable to move for over 18 hours. The woman was severely dehydrated and hypothermic, and doctors later said that she would not have survived another few hours without medical intervention. The emergency lights had somehow detected a life-threatening situation that was completely invisible from the street. Other officers began to notice Gonzalez's unusual success rate in preventing accidents and finding people who needed help. When asked about her methods, Gonzalez would say that she had learned to pay attention to her equipment and trust her instincts when something seemed unusual. She never mentioned Park's spirit or the supernatural warnings, knowing that such claims would undermine her credibility. The partnership between Gonzalez and Park's spirit became so effective that the emergency lights evolved into a sophisticated communication system. Different light patterns would indicate the urgency of situations, the type of response needed, and even the approximate location of people who required assistance. Gonzalez learned to interpret the signals like a language, understanding that Park was using his knowledge and experience to guide her patrol activities. The light's predictions became so accurate that Gonzalez began positioning herself in areas where the warnings indicated trouble was likely to occur. She would patrol routes that the lights suggested, respond to locations they highlighted, and adjust her schedule based on their guidance. Her proactive approach prevented dozens of accidents and saved multiple lives over the course of several months. The supernatural activity reached its climax during a major storm in April, when multiple emergencies were occurring simultaneously across Gonzalez's patrol area. The emergency lights created a continuous display of different patterns, directing her from one crisis to another with perfect timing. She was able to assist with 3 separate car accidents, locate 2 missing persons, and prevent a potential suicide, all because the lights guided her to the right places at the right times. After that night, the emergency light malfunctions became less frequent, but more targeted. Park's spirit seemed to focus on the most critical situations, conserving his energy for moments when his intervention could make the greatest difference. The lights would activate for serious emergencies, but remain normal during routine patrol activities. Gonzalez still drives the same patrol unit, and she has learned to work with Park's spirit as a partner, rather than seeing the light malfunctions as problems. She begins each shift by checking her emergency lights and saying quietly, "Thanks for watching out for us, Officer Park." The lights always respond with a brief, gentle flash, acknowledging that another shift of protecting and serving is about to begin. To this day, Gonzalez views her emergency lighting system not as equipment, but as a communication device that connects her to the wisdom and experience of a fallen colleague. She has learned that the most important warnings often come from the most unexpected sources, and that dedication to protecting others can find ways to continue even after the ultimate sacrifice has been made. Officer Daniel Hayes thought his patrol unit needed immediate maintenance when the emergency sirens started playing on their own in September 2023. The electronic siren system would activate at random times, producing sounds that didn't match any of the programmed tones. Instead of the familiar wail, yelp, or horn patterns, the speakers would emit haunting melodies that sounded almost like lullabies. What Hayes didn't realize was that the sirens were trying to guide him to people who desperately needed to be found. Hayes worked search and rescue for the Willowbrook Police Department, specializing in missing persons cases in the vast wilderness areas surrounding the small mountain town. His patrol vehicle was equipped with a powerful PA system and emergency sirens designed to cut through dense forest and reach people who might be lost or injured miles from the nearest road. The first incident occurred during a search for 8-year-old Emma Chen, who had wandered away from a family camping trip in Pine Ridge State Forest. Hayes was driving slowly along logging roads, periodically stopping to call Emma's name through his PA system, when his sirens suddenly activated on their own. Instead of the sharp emergency tones, the speakers produced a soft musical melody that sounded like a children's song. Hayes immediately turned off the siren system, but the melody continued to play for several minutes. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, with a slow, repetitive pattern that seemed designed to attract attention without causing fear. As the music played, Hayes noticed something extraordinary. Birds in the surrounding forest began responding to the melody, creating their own calls that seemed to harmonize with the strange music. Following the direction the melody seemed to be pointing, Hayes drove deeper into the forest until he found Emma sitting by a small creek, building a dam with rocks and sticks. She was unharmed, but had been missing for over 6 hours. When Hayes asked how she had stayed calm during her ordeal, Emma said she had been listening to the pretty music that had been playing in the forest, keeping her company and helping her not feel scared. Over the following weeks, the siren system continued to produce unusual sounds during search operations. The melodies varied depending on the situation. Gentle, soothing tones for lost children, more urgent musical patterns for injured hikers, and complex harmonies that seemed designed to cut through severe weather conditions. Hayes began to realize that the sounds were perfectly calibrated to attract the attention of missing persons without frightening them. The most dramatic rescue occurred during the search for 78-year-old Robert Martinez, an Alzheimer's patient who had wandered away from his assisted living facility during a winter storm. Hayes had been searching for over 8 hours in near whiteout conditions when his sirens activated, producing a warm, comforting melody that reminded him of old folk songs his grandmother used to sing. The music was loud enough to carry through the storm, but gentle enough to avoid startling someone who might be confused or disoriented. Hayes followed the direction the melody seemed to be traveling, driving through snow-covered trails that his vehicle could barely navigate. After 20 minutes, he found Martinez huddled under a fallen tree, conscious but severely hypothermic. Martinez later told nurses that he had been following the angel music through the forest, believing it was leading him home. The melody had kept him moving and prevented him from lying down in the snow, which would have been fatal in the sub-zero temperatures. Doctors said that without the motivation provided by the music, Martinez would not have survived the night. Hayes began researching the history of his patrol vehicle and discovered that it had previously been assigned to Officer Sarah Mitchell, a search and rescue specialist who had died in a helicopter crash while searching for missing hikers 18 months earlier. Mitchell had been legendary in the department for her ability to find lost people, often succeeding where other searchers had failed. Colleagues remembered Mitchell's unconventional methods, particularly her use of music during search operations. She would play lullabies and folk songs through her PA system, believing that familiar, comforting sounds were more effective than loud sirens at encouraging lost people to reveal their locations. Mitchell's approach had saved dozens of lives over her 12-year career. The connection between Mitchell's techniques and the supernatural melodies became clear when Hayes recognized one of the tunes his sirens were playing. It was Amazing Grace, Mitchell's favorite song to use during searches involving elderly patients with dementia. The melody was exactly as she had played it, with the same tempo and musical phrasing that had characterized her approach to search and rescue work. Hayes began experimenting with the phenomenon, allowing the sirens to play their mysterious melodies while he followed their guidance through the wilderness. The music always seemed to know exactly what type of person was missing and what sounds would be most likely to attract their attention. Children heard playful, animated tunes, while adults heard more complex melodies that conveyed both urgency and safety. The supernatural aspects of the situation became more apparent when the sirens started producing music that corresponded to the cultural backgrounds of missing persons. During a search for a lost Native American elder, the speakers played traditional tribal melodies that Hayes had never heard before. When searching for a missing immigrant family, the music included elements of their homeland's folk songs, creating an instant connection that transcended language barriers. Hayes realized that Mitchell's spirit was using the siren system to continue her search and rescue work, drawing on her extensive knowledge of human psychology and her intuitive understanding of what sounds would comfort and attract different types of people. The melodies were precisely crafted to appeal to specific individuals, using music as a universal language that could reach people regardless of their age, condition, or cultural background. The most remarkable rescue occurred during a search for a group of teenage hikers who had become lost during a weekend camping trip. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional search methods were failing to locate the missing teens. Hayes's sirens began playing a complex melody that incorporated elements of popular music, creating a sound that was both contemporary and timeless. The melody was designed to be recognizable to young people while conveying a sense of safety and rescue. As Hayes followed the music's guidance through treacherous mountain terrain, he eventually heard voices responding to the siren song. The teenagers had been trapped on a narrow ledge after a rock slide, but they had been singing along with the mysterious music, which helped Hayes pinpoint their exact location. The rescue required technical climbing equipment and took several hours to complete, but all 5 teenagers were brought to safety without serious injuries. They later described how the music had kept their spirits up during the ordeal and helped them believe that rescue was coming. The melody had created a psychological anchor that prevented panic and maintained hope during their most frightening moments. Other search and rescue teams began requesting Hayes's assistance on difficult cases, noting his unusual success rate in locating missing persons. When asked about his methods, Hayes would explain that he believed in using all available tools, including sound, to communicate with people who might be lost or injured. He never mentioned Mitchell's spirit or the supernatural nature of his siren system. The partnership between Hayes and Mitchell's spirit evolved into a sophisticated rescue operation that transcended normal police procedures. The sirens would produce specific melodies that indicated the condition and location of missing persons, allowing Hayes to prioritize his search efforts and approach victims with the right equipment and mindset. The music became so precise that Hayes could determine from the melody alone whether a missing person was injured, hypothermic, trapped, or simply lost. Different musical patterns indicated different levels of urgency, helping him allocate resources effectively and coordinate with other rescue teams. Mitchell's knowledge and experience were being transmitted through sound, creating a rescue system that was both supernatural and highly practical. The sirens' rescue melodies became a signature of Hayes's search operations, with other officers learning to recognize the significance of different musical patterns. The sounds had become a language of rescue, conveying information about missing persons and guiding search efforts with supernatural precision. Hayes still uses the same patrol vehicle, and he has learned to trust the musical guidance completely. He begins each search operation by activating his siren system and saying quietly, "Help us find them, Officer Mitchell." The speakers always respond with a gentle test tone, followed by whatever melody is needed to reach the people who are waiting to be found. To this day, Hayes views his siren system not as equipment, but as a musical instrument played by a master search and rescue specialist who refused to let death end her mission of bringing lost people home. He has learned that the most effective rescue calls are not always the loudest ones, and that sometimes the most important sounds are the gentle melodies that remind people they are not alone in the darkness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the darkest corners of reality. These stories remind us that the most terrifying experiences often come from the places we least expect: our everyday tools, our trusted technology, and the very systems designed to protect us. If this tale left you questioning what's really happening behind the scenes of our modern world, then you understand why I'm drawn to these true accounts of the unexplained. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story gave you chills. Subscribe for more real-life nightmares. And remember, reality is often stranger and more frightening than any fiction we could imagine. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next dark tale.